June 22, 1940. The French government signs away its country, not after years of grinding attrition, but after 43 days. France had 5 million soldiers, a modern air force, and a navy powerful enough to contest the Atlantic. The real explanation has been buried under a myth for 80 years, and that myth was built by the very men who lost. The myth has been running for 80 years, and it sounds like this. France was weak. Its soldiers were poorly trained, its equipment outdated, its will to fight already broken before the first German tank crossed the border. It's a clean story. It's also, in almost every particular, wrong. Start with the army itself. In May 1940, France put 5 million men in the field, more than it had mobilized in 1914. The war it had somehow survived. Defense spending had been climbing since the mid-1930s, funding a rebuilt air force, a powerful naval fleet, and the most ambitious fortification project in modern European history. The Maginot Line, named for André Maginot, who served multiple terms as France's Minister of War during the 1920s and early 1930s, and was its chief political champion, was not a symbol of timidity. It was a deliberate, expensive, carefully engineered response to a specific trauma. Nearly 1.4 million French soldiers had died in the Great War, most of them on French soil. The men who designed the Maginot Line had watched that happen. They built something that would make it impossible to happen again the same way. That wasn't weakness. That was grief, translated into concrete. Now look at what happened when the fighting actually started. Between May 10th and June 22nd, approximately 60,000 French soldiers were killed. 6 weeks. That number alone should end the conversation about French courage, but it rarely does. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht lost 30% of its tanks and planes during the Battle of France. 30%. That is not the casualty rate of an army walking through an open door. In the village of Ston, in the Ardennes, French and German forces fought for control of the same ground from May 15th to May 27th. The village changed hands 17 times. 17. French infantry held the Scheldt Canal in Belgium for 6 days straight, slowing the German advance north and buying time the Allies desperately needed. And when 6 divisions of the French First Army were encircled near Lille, they did not surrender immediately. They kept fighting until June 1st, and that decision, that refusal to fold, is what allowed the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate from Dunkirk. The French rearguard made Dunkirk possible. That fact tends not to make it into the version of history most people inherit. France did not collapse because it couldn't fight. It collapsed because its commanders were fighting a war that had ended 20 years earlier. French military doctrine in 1940 was built on the lessons of 1914-18, continuous fronts and defined objectives. It was the methodical use of firepower to fix and destroy the enemy. A strategy designed for a static war, a war of grinding attrition where the side that held its line longest eventually won. That strategy had worked. It had won. And that was precisely the problem. The French High Command had learned the right lessons from the wrong war. They had built a doctrine, an army, and a fortification system to fight a conflict that no longer existed. The Germans were not interested in a static war. They had no intention of walking into the Maginot Line's kill zones. They had a different idea entirely, one that depended on speed, concentration, and a willingness to take risks. The village of Ston changed hands 17 times. Did that surprise you, or did you already suspect resistance was tougher? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what happened next reveals the one decision that made all of that courage irrelevant. The Ardennes forest in May 1940 was not a battlefield. It was a problem no one had bothered to solve. The terrain was dense. The roads were narrow. Everyone agreed it didn't need solving. Military planners on both sides had studied the same maps and reached the same conclusion. Armored columns couldn't move through there. The forest would swallow tanks. The logistics alone would be catastrophic. the Ardennes was classified as impassable. That classification had quietly shaped everything. That assumption was the crack in the entire Allied line. While France's best units moved north into Belgium to meet what they believed was the main German thrust, the Wehrmacht was doing something else. It was concentrating its armored divisions directly into the Ardennes, the ground the French had dismissed, the ground no rational commander was supposed to use. The Germans crossed the Meuse at Sedan on May 13th, 3 days after the invasion began, and then they turned west, not south, driving hard behind the entire Allied line, cutting it off from reinforcement, from retreat, from any coherent response. The encirclement was complete before French command had processed it. The Allied armies in Belgium weren't beaten in the field. They were simply no longer connected to the war they thought they were fighting. The Germans took risks that by any conventional military logic they had no right to take. Concentrating armor in the Ardennes violated every principle of orthodox strategy. The roads could barely support the column. The risk of a single counterattack collapsing the operation was real. By any standard calculation, it should not have worked. It worked because the French were certain it wouldn't. Certainty in war is the most dangerous thing you can carry. The French High Command had built their doctrine, their deployments, and their entire strategic imagination around what they knew. And what they knew was 1918. Continuous fronts, fixed objectives, the slow, methodical application of firepower. Historian Michael Bourlet put it plainly. The defeat was intellectual and doctrinal, the old cliché of fighting the previous war. Commanders could not adapt to the conflict in front of them because every instinct, every lesson, every year of training told them they already understood war. The Germans understood that they didn't, and they gambled on it. What followed was not a rout of cowards. It was the collapse of a system that had no mechanism for the situation it was now inside. Units that knew how to hold a line had no doctrine for a war that had already gone around them. The army didn't break because it lacked courage. It broke because courage alone cannot substitute for a command structure that can think faster than the enemy moves. And then came the Vichy regime. On June 22, 1940, the French government signed the armistice at Compiègne, the same forest clearing where Germany had signed the armistice with France in November 1918. The same railway car, the same coordinates. Hitler chose the location deliberately. The symbolism was total, and what followed was a story. A story of a weak army, an impossible enemy, a hopeless cause that no French soldier could have been expected to overcome. That story had a purpose. It made collaboration easier to justify. It made the men who surrendered look like realists rather than failures. It buried the actual explanation, doctrinal rigidity, intellectual paralysis, a high command that couldn't adapt, under a myth that lasted 80 years. France fell in 46 days, not because it lacked soldiers or weapons or the will to fight. It lacked the one thing no defense budget can purchase and no fortification can replace: the willingness to think differently when everything it had ever learned told it not to. In 1940, France had one of the largest armies on Earth, nearly 5 million trained soldiers, a fortress wall that had taken a decade to build, an alliance with Britain, every advantage on paper, and in 46 days, it was gone. Not because France was weak, but because France was fighting the wrong war, with the wrong plan, led by men who had already decided it couldn't be won. History doesn't just remember who lost, it remembers why. And the why is almost always more disturbing than the defeat itself. That's what EVM is here for. The decisions behind the disasters, the moments that should never have happened, but did. If that's the kind of history you want, subscribe, because the next story is already waiting.